Good morning and welcome. We're about to start our program. I'm Charlene Wolof at the Jewish Community Foundation, the Chief Impact Officer, and the Jewish Community Foundation is pleased to host today's webinar along with your monthly sessions. I hand it over to Jay, who's going to take it for the rest of the way. Thank you, Jay, and thank you for attending.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for attending. Our program this morning, I think, is going to be very interesting and very topical, given that everything that's going on right now. The council does want to welcome you and thank you for attending. And I'm going to, talk about this morning what we have upcoming very quickly. So this program is the real estate microeconomics to ground level, how it impacts you and your family. And then next month, November 3rd, we have Linda Sands on planning using charitable remainder trust for IRAs, planning with IRAs and retirement benefits. Very topical. December 1st, we have Joe Quinn, Chief Investment Strategist at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, a very dynamic and frank-speaking presenter who will be giving us his take on the post-election. January 5th, Dennis Jaffe, noted family wealth and family business succession planner with the presentation of his most recent book, Borrow from Your Grandchildren, the evolution of the 100-year family enterprise. And then February 2nd, Mark Morris and Phil Sullivan, two members of our group, will be talking part 2 of the planning for the 30 to 150 million taxable estates, from the basics to the creative to the exotic. Today's sponsor is First American Trust, and Chip Graham, who runs the real estate department for First American, is going to tell us more about what they do and how they do it. Chip, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you to the North County Estate Planning Council and the Jewish Community Foundation of San Diego for allowing us to give some information on First American and some information on the real estate company. Just to start off and give a little bit of background on First American, it started off here in Orange County way back in the late 1880s. C.E. Parker saw a need for abstract title and created a company. That company moved as Orange County moved, and for 70 years or so, kind of went along with Orange County. In the late 1940s, Don Parker Kennedy, the grandson, after law school, joined First American and had a vision of expansion. That expansion is now 18,000 employees, 900 offices, and worldwide operations, and a $5 billion company. First American Financial is really a real estate service company. They have title, 1031, home warranty, property casualty, and part of that is the First American Trust Company. That all started back in 1950 with a title client who wanted to assemble property in Orange County, more specifically Anaheim, California. And they created a trust company to hold this property in land trust. That individual was Walt Disney, and that land is now where Disneyland is. From that period, the trust company did grow as well. We've provided professional asset management and trust services for the last 70 years or so. We have in-house analysts, investment advisors, portfolio managers, and their real strategy is large cap core and with many other products to satisfy our clients' needs. The First American Real Estate Department is part of that trust company. We have approximately 200 properties or so, mainly on the West Coast. Part of the trust company now is a federal savings bank that allows us to hold title in all 50 states. And we have properties from Anchorage, Alaska to Seattle to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego, Hawaii, Arizona. So in many, many states, mostly on the West Coast. Those properties include single family residence, multifamily, industrial, retail, office. So a real mixed bag of a lot of different property. We also have ranches and farms and do mineral interests. So that is really what we're managing. We act as an asset manager as well as a property manager. In places like Anchorage, Alaska, we act as an asset manager. We hire property management and review all of their overall property management and their statements and tenant relations and all of that. Our fees are based more on our gross rental collection versus value. We've seen over the last many years as cap rates have compressed and values have really increased, that the fees seem to get a little out of whack with what as values increased. So our fees are based on 8.5% of gross rental collection. So just here, kind of introducing the real estate group. We have a team on the West Coast managing these assets and providing those services. We also include and continue with the land trusts. We have collection accounts, escrow accounts, and a whole array of real estate functions. So just wrapping up, just want to talk just real quick. We have had many issues this year with COVID-19 and rental collection. As you can imagine, our First American Trust beneficiaries, income beneficiaries who survive on this income have been very nervous, have had many calls on these topics. And we've done a lot of rent abatement, a lot of rent deferral, and have really tried to keep our tenants in place. And so as we move through and hopefully the world opens back up again, we will have these tenants and continue on. So I appreciate the time. I think that's a quick little elevator speech on First American Title, First American Trust, First American Financial. And I hope you guys have a great program today, and just thank you again. Jay?
All right, thank you very much, Chip. I appreciate you stepping in and doing that. Now we're gonna jump over to the panel, and we have Doug Wilson of Doug Wilson Companies, who I'm sure we all know, is going to be leading the panel. And I'm going to, hand it over to Doug to introduce his panelists and take it from here. Doug?
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate that very much. And good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. Obviously, I want to thank our leader, Bill Super. Bill has done a wonderful job during these challenging times over the last 6-8 months. And kudos to Bill, and we appreciate him allowing us to present this panel today. The Jewish Community Foundation has been a wonderful supporter, and Charlene is really the centerpiece of allowing all this to happen technologically, and we appreciate that. And Jay is a friend, and First American is a wonderful company that we have dealt with on and off for many times over many years. So anyway, thank you to you for sponsoring this as well. So again, Doug Wilson, Douglas Wilson Companies, you've known me best in the past. I've been on a number of prior panels. talking not about my development background with Symphony Towers and other projects, but about our legacy asset management platform, dealing with families with real estate, in some of the challenges these families have in dealing with real estate, working with other professionals. And Robert Valera, who's joining us today, has been a participant as well. Today, however, we have a, and by the way, and as to the balance of the panelists, pardon me, we're very pleased to have Tim Wright. Tim is with JLL, formerly with HFF, and is a senior managing director of capital markets. I've had the pleasure of dealing with Tim in the past on a number of occasions, and he is a true professional that can add, I think, unique insight into the world of capital markets, which we'll touch on in a moment. Of equal importance, Mike Mosier is a seasoned veteran with CBRE for several decades and his own firm, Retail Insight, the last many years. And I think Mike can add a perspective on the retail sector of the market, which is obviously directly impacted on many of you that own retail assets, dealing with tenant issues and other challenges that I think will be a great topic. And then finally, Robert Valera, who is known to many of you with Voight. He will be providing insight and as to the multifamily market, but just has general insight into the world of real estate as well. So to set the table for this discussion, these are quote, unprecedented times. I mean, people are sick and tired of hearing about, we've never seen this before, but we have never seen this before. I have built a career predicated upon cycles, and I've always been a believer that cycles are powerful, inevitable, and often unpredictable. But who would have thought that we would have had this economic engine that was very strong, disrupted rather by a pandemic? It's only something we could have read about. But the reality of it is we are now dealing with the reality of that situation where the brakes were put on our economy and the economies around the world. And these impacts are systemic and they're long-term. We have been dealing over these past many months with a massive influx of liquidity into the markets provided by the federal government, with PPE and other funding for consumers as well. I call this the age of forbearance. Most lenders of all sectors have been working with borrowers as they appropriately should politically and just generally, and have been forbearing on terms of loans and restructuring loans, giving people more time to deal with things. But at some point, we are going to be, the area of forbearance is going to be diminished. And we see that approaching us rapidly as the first of the year comes, as most of these influx of capital are now waning. We may have additional influx, but at this point that is not in place. So today we want to really set the table with a high-level discussion of what's happening in the markets, what we have seen up to this point this year as step one. As step two, which we'll talk about later, is what do we see in the future? And how does this all relate to families? How does this all relate to all of you in this room today, all of the professionals and the families and the challenges you're going to be dealing with real estate? And what are some of the recommended strategies and protocols that might be helpful? This clearly is not Armageddon, but we must be grown up and realistic about what we have been through and what we see in front of us, because for all of the reasons that I don't have to overstate. So with that having been said, I would like to now have Tim Wright spend some time. He's got a few slides to review just his comments generally on the capital markets, the various segments of those markets, what he has seen year to date and what he sees going forward. Tim? Hello, Tim.
Sorry. There's a lot of stats in these slides. more than it really needs to be. The general takeaway is that commercial mortgages on the whole are doing pretty well, maybe even surprisingly well. If you dig into it, and the way we like to look at commercial mortgage performance is really by product type. We'll look at it across from apartments to retail to hotel. Then we'll look at the types of lenders, agencies, life companies, banks, and so on. In general, and probably not surprisingly, if you go across the landscape, multifamily, which is a pretty necessary shelter, being a pretty necessary product type, is doing pretty well. It varies from region to region. At JLL, we tracked about 1 million plus units through clients that participated in a reporting program. And generally speaking, A properties, again, maybe not surprisingly, we're doing better from a collection standpoint than B and C. San Diego, for instance, was doing better than Vegas. And markets that were exposed to a lot of hospitality, even energy like Houston, we saw variances. But generally speaking, multifamily, and we'll see this when we talk about the types of lenders, has been a great performer. Industrial, same thing. Part of the movement to online retail or online acquisitions, online purchasing. Amazon's on a tear right now, picking up space, and we're seeing that just in the industrial market. Industrial, in my career, I've never seen it as popular as it is right now, and it's performing very well. I mentioned a couple other product types that you typically don't come across, and they don't represent a huge proportion of the market, but life science is very strong right now. In our own market in San Diego, if you look at Sorrento Mesa, almost any office building that's in Sorrento Mesa is being contemplated as a conversion to life science. We're seeing life science move downtown. So keep your eye on that product type. So far, it's been very strong. Similarly, self-storage, for obvious reasons, has done pretty well. On the other side of the equation, we've got softness in hospitality, which we would intuitively expect, and in retail. Hospitality probably being the biggest loser in this market right now. When you break up hospitality by types of hotels, you start to see some distinctions. For instance, drive to leisure, stuff that's on the coast here, Mission Beach or La Jolla, Del Mar, it's doing pretty well. Avalon's doing pretty well. Cape Cod's doing pretty well. So people that can't fly to Hawaii, people that can't fly to Europe are hitting up a lot of the leisure products. So that's doing pretty well. Where we're really feeling softness in the hotel market is in the group convention, big box, we call it, or full service hotels. And really, there's no honest answer as to when those will come back. They could miss an entire cycle, or they could be back this spring. And as we get into the types of lenders, you'll see this product type show up in their own numbers. Mike will get into retail. Retail is the next softest product type. And again, there's a distinction between what works and what doesn't, what's relatively healthy and what's not. You'd understand food and drug anchored retail is doing better than retail that is not necessity based. So, with that brief discussion of the product types, I'll move into the types of lenders. And again, you'll see their performance related to the strength of the particular product types. Agency, Freddie and Fannie are multifamily. They have a single family. Obviously, most of their business is single family, but they have huge multifamily lending businesses, both of them. The reality is that Fannie reports differently than Freddie does, but both, if you really look through the numbers, are less than 1% delinquent, 60-day or plus. Couple reasons for that, their people aren't moving. Number one, you're seeing retention rates in apartments. Robert will probably discuss that a little bit. But if someone's in April or May, if someone's apartment a lease came due, they likely extended it, if not for a year, for 6 months, because they didn't want to go around and look at new apartments. It just wasn't a good time. The other reason is their apartments, for many people that work remotely, became their office. So Apartments have done very well. The agencies have done very well. They are being proactive in many markets like Las Vegas. They're requiring borrowers set aside 12 months of debt service payments. So it's impacting certain markets that they've kind of redlined or targeted as being potential problems down the road. I'll touch on CMBS, and we'll get in a couple slides briefly, but CMBS is kind of back to recession level delinquencies. And that's been exacerbated by CMBS 2.0, which really started up about 2012, 2013, has a disproportionate amount of retail, unanchored retail particularly, and hotel in it. So we'd have pools that had 25% hotel, 25% retail. So they've taken it on the chin. They're really back to the 2009, 2010 delinquency levels. If you go to life companies, they're remarkably strong. They were even in the last recession. I think their delinquency rate in the last recession was 0.5% compared to CMBS, which might have been up to 12 or 13 at one point. So life companies, which don't do a lot of hotel loans and don't do a lot of unanchored retail, have been very healthy. Similarly, banks have been healthy. Part of that is because in this last cycle, and I'm going back now 7 or 8 years, they haven't done a lot of construction. They don't do a lot of hotel. They've been doing a lot of low levered term loans and lines of credit with credit-worthy institutions. So banks, knock on wood, are quite healthy right now relative to some of the other lenders out there. A final point is that relief requests are trending down. There was a term I saw called terminal delinquency velocity, which I thought was a pretty good term. Basically, anybody that needed help has asked for help, right? Nobody was waiting until October or November of 2020 to get relief from their banks. The big question going forward is, how will hotels respond? And the other one that's not so intuitive is office. Office has been strong, but will there be behavioral changes in the way people lease office going forward? Will they move to the suburbs? Will they take less space? Or the counter current there would be, do they need more space to provide more offices and so on? So there's a big debate on how office will perform in 2021 and going forward. And then there's a couple slides, and I won't spend much time on them, but and they're really kind of just vary by their scale and timeline. This goes back to 2000, but you'll see that if you look across the board, the far upper right-hand corner of CMBS, they're back to the Great Recession levels. Whereas probably the most interesting is banks. They really got hit in the Great Recession. They're doing pretty well right now. That's the upper left chart. And then moving on to the next slide, you'll see that just a smaller time frame and a little bit of scale here. Again, banks are in the upper left corner. They really took it on the chin. A lot of construction exposure in the last recession, not so much now. They're doing quite well. Where you see the big jump is in the far right. Again, upper right, CMBS is back. And then down below, that's a little deceiving because the scale has changed. You'll see the top number is 1%. That's Fannie and Freddie, that's the agencies. Fannie reports a little differently. They're a little more conservative in how they're reporting delinquencies. But generally speaking, really across the board, banks, life companies, agencies are all very healthy. CMBS is getting beat up again. My final point is the markets are active. CMBS is back out there. The debt funds are back out there. The banks remain traditionally conservative, but they're out making loans. And then the life companies are hungry to get money out. So that slide just shows really where everyone is relative to the range since the last recession, or since going back to 96, in fact. And CMBS is at the top of their historical delinquency range. Life companies still at the bottom. Fannie Mae, in my opinion, that's a reporting variation. Fannie and Freddie are very, very close to each other. It's multifamily. It's sub 1%. And banks and thrifts, I think, importantly, are in very good shape.
Thank you, Tim. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Tim, isn't it safe to say that, I mean, the larger banks really were only lending, as you indicated, to absolute credit-worthy borrowers. So they really weren't in the real estate game nearly to the extent they were prior to the last recession. I'd like you to address that. And then also clarify for the audience exactly the nuance of CMBS, how CMBS works, and some of the challenges that CMBS has if you're a borrower and dealing with them.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a good point about banks. The world of banking, from my standpoint as an intermediary, and also from just direct borrower standpoint, banks, at least the large kind of what we call money center banks, the US banks, the B of A's, the Wells of the world, have reduced their client lists and have gone aggressively after a smaller group of clients. They've been very active in line of credit activity in real estate to REITs and large high net worth and institutional borrowers. They're less transactional and more relationship than they used to be. They tend to be quite conservative, and you're seeing that in the numbers right now. Since they really kind of took that posture post-recession, 2008 through 2012, call it, a whole new industry, and they're not really showing up here technically, is the debt fund industry. And there's probably 30 plus legitimate debt funds that use maybe a bank line or a CLO to structure their loans. But just about everybody, even the life companies now have debt funds. We call them shadow banks in a way, but they've kind of taken over the transactional or transitional financing for rehabs, in many cases construction. They tend to be more expensive. I think it's an evolution in the marketplace because I think they're appropriately pricing construction and real estate risk where it exists. Banks have chosen to keep their balance sheets clean, and so they've kind of given up that share of the market to debt funds. Debt funds aren't shown here because debt funds traditionally are using equity for their subordinate pieces and then using banks for the senior pieces. To your other question, CMBS is way down from its height in 2007. It was $250 billion in volume. It's probably just a little bit over 100 billion in 2019. So it's had its wings clipped a bit. I think it's more sophisticated. I think the rating agencies are more sophisticated, but you still have a situation where you borrow from CMBS, the pool gets securitized and sold off, and you kind of don't have a lender anymore to talk to. You can't call up your friendly banker or your life company relationship. You're dealing with a servicer, and that may be any stage of servicer, but a special servicer is where you end up if you do a monetary default or look for structural relief. And that tends to be a pretty difficult and bureaucratic process. It could take months and months and months to get anywhere. It's part of why CMBS lost a lot of popularity with otherwise strong borrowers in this cycle. But they're less forgiving and more willing to move stuff into seller servicing mode, and then more willing to start selling notes and or foreclosing. So, while they provide a good function, I think, in the marketplace, it's not a place you want to be if you're not able to make your payments.
Tim, thank you for that oversight, and thank you for that nuance of CMBS, which is, collateralized mortgage and mortgage pools, but they're very difficult to deal with. Later, when we start talking about those that are less fortunate, because Tim is right, the larger commercial real estate world is generally pretty healthy, but for these collateralized mortgages. But, at ground level, there are a lot of people that are substantially less healthy. And when we get later about moving forward after the forbearance expires, how are some of these challenges going to be dealt with into next year and beyond? So let's now segue into retail. And Mike, love your comments about what you're dealing with at the ground level on a sector that's clearly, is being impacted, and to get your insight into that. And so this floor is yours.
No, thank you, Doug. I think before I jump right into what we're seeing today on COVID, I think it's important to do a little
kind of a brief history lesson of where retail has been. It'll kind of segue into where we are today. If you think back to the retail of your grandparents and your parents and maybe even your childhood, retail started out in urban cores. It was a department store in an urban core serving the residents. And as we saw people expand out into the suburbs, the department stores naturally went out into the suburbs, and we now had regional malls proliferating across the country, serving the suburbs. They were typically 3 or 4 department store anchors. And in the old days, the Montgomery Wards and the Sears and the J.C. Penney's of the world sold you your batteries for your car. They sold you your tires. They sold you your socks and underwear. They were a one-stop shop for basically all of your goods and services. And now fast forward to the 90s, we had a huge proliferation of specialty retail boxes, primarily focused around pricing and value and convenience. So you look at the chains like Ross, TJ Maxx, Walmart, Target, Dick's Sporting Goods, Sports Authority, a number of specialty stores expanded across the country, and each one of those started chipping away at the sales of department stores, essentially. Those sales that were once in 1988 department stores represented, roughly 50% of all retail sales. Fast forward to today, and department stores are now at about 10% of retail sales. And where did those sales go? They basically went to all of the category retail that has proliferated out into the suburbs. So what we're seeing now is really an implosion of the regional mall sector. A number of those department stores, but for the fact that they own their own real estate, would have already been gone and gone the way of the Montgomery Wards and the Buffums and the Bullocks. Sears and J.C. Penney's and Macy's have only survived to date because they own a lot of their real estate and have cheap rent. So that segment of the market was already changing prior to COVID, and we were already seeing a big disruption as it relates to regional malls and specialty retailing. So next slide represents where we've gone in the United States. And as a result of all of the big boxes and the proliferation of retail, you can see that United States has a very heavy retail square footage per person. I mean, we're 6 to 8 times what many other countries are in terms of the square footage of retail. We've got a massive oversupply. Now, that being said, we are a more consumer-oriented economy. We buy more than some of the other countries do, so we won't see that shrink down to the level of something in the UK, but we've got about 8.5 billion square feet of retail now, and we think that's in the future is going to shrink down to 5 billion square feet. And where's that going to come from? Most likely regional malls and defunct power centers that are no longer viable. So on the next slide, over the last 10 years or so, retail has really been focused on a handful of categories. The grocery sector has been very strong. We've seen a number of specialty grocers that have expanded, like see the Sprouts, Trader Joe's. Those have all been very healthy. Fitness and health has proliferated. That's the big box gyms, and also the smaller fitness like Orange Theory and a number, Pilates studios, Yoga 6, and a number of those categories have been very healthy. The food and beverage business has been on fire. All the chef-driven restaurants that have expanded over the last 6 or 7 years. We've probably seen a 30 or 40% increase in food and beverage as people have been dining out a lot more. And then the experience part of retail, which is some of the reason why a lot of us go out and go shopping, is to just get out, and it's an event, it's It's a fun experience to go out and browse and shop with your family. So where are we now? Next slide. I mean, COVID, as Tim mentioned, has really been like a dichotomy of winners and losers. Those deemed essential have seen a bonanza. A lot of the grocers during the early months of COVID saw their sales go up by a 20-25% factor. I mean, unprecedented. And those like Costco, Target, Walmart, I mean, all winners. Amazon, as we know, as people have been ordering more out of their homes and getting deliveries, has seen a big increase. So there are a number of winners that all focus in the essential business category. The losers, are all of those that are experiential and fitness gyms, movie theaters, any sit-down restaurant, particularly now, those that don't have the ability to seat outdoors are completely dead. And a lot of the retailers that were hanging on, that were already on their way out, like Pier 1 and Steinmart and others, have now officially gone by the wayside. I was talking to one of my clients, Macerich, who owns regional malls, in late May, and this will just give you an example of the kind of distress that COVID caused. But their average monthly rental collections across their mall portfolio was $120 million per month. And in the 2 months after COVID hit, they averaged about $15 million of rent collections. So the distress was immediate. It was, clearly hitting those categories that were non-essential and were closed down. Some general observations I guess I would make as it relates to COVID. Retailers and restaurants are not set up to stop and start. They carry inventory, they carry food. It's not that easy to just open a restaurant and shut it down. A number of the larger restaurants can spend $100,000 to $200,000 just to open back up again. So getting shut down and opening back up is not viable for most of these operators. They also don't carry a lot of cash on their books. The majority of even the public companies may have a handful of months reserves, but they're not set up to carry forward and pay rent in this type of an environment. And their margins are thin as it is. So a lot of the retailers and the restaurants are operating on a small profit margin. If you're now asking them to operate with 1 out of 4 tables, it's just not viable. They can't make a profit doing that. So we've spent the last 5 months primarily helping our clients navigate through this COVID crisis, and it's really a tenant by tenant analysis of figuring out what you do with each operator. There is no one quick answer. Each situation needs to be analyzed, and you come up with a strategy based upon all the facts of that particular lease, what the space is worth. Is the tenant viable? Will the tenant ever be viable and come back? Are they trying? Are they not trying? I mean, all those factors come into play. And I think we're all geared towards solving things. And in our world, the toughest thing right now is that in a lot of cases you can't solve it. So we're telling our clients in some cases just to wait it out and don't try and solve the situation until the dust clears.
Mike, thank you for that. Now, later when we talk about, how is this cycle different and how are we all dealing with this cycle, Mike, I want you to let's have a very interactive discussion, a little more detail about how specifically you're dealing with these tenant by tenant situations where they're coming back and asking for rent relief, and how those rent reliefs are being structured, Are they forgiving rent? Are they just abating it for a period and tacking on the tail end of the lease? All of those nuances. So we're going to have ample time later to talk about that, because I think there are a lot of people in this program today that are owners of retail, not malls particularly, but own neighborhood retail and the like, and grocery anchored centers that I think we want to go into a little more detail. So anyway, stand by and we'll get to that. Let's segue now to multifamily, which is something near and dear to all of our hearts. You know, Robert has been a cohort of mine on these panels from the inception, and so he's, you know, uniquely suited to address that, just general observations on the market. So Robert.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to take us all back to about February, prior to the pandemic. Do you remember that far back? It seems like more than 6-8 months ago. But you probably saw the same kind of news articles I did, that half of Americans had less than 1 month of savings in the bank. And so when the pandemic hit, I can recall going home and having a chat with my wife and trying to project out, okay, where's this going? And I said, you realize within 1 to 2 months, we're probably going to be at 10% delinquencies on our collections in our apartments. And within 3 to 4 months, 25% delinquency. Now, fortunately, we're low levered. Most of my clients are low levered, but you play that out and you would anticipate within 6 to 9 months of seeing pretty widespread mortgage defaults in the multifamily sector, leading to sharp drops in value. So here's the good news. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. Most of the rents are coming in, at least here in San Diego County. We're looking at over 90% collections for most of the management companies, what they're reporting. Large owners with substantial portfolios of property, as I talk with them, they're seeing collections up in the 92% range, sometimes as high as 95%. What we are seeing occur, though, is movements within the market. And on this first slide, I actually want to direct your eyes down to the bottom, the Central Business District, CBD. This is basically telling us there's been a 4% increase in vacancy there. This makes sense. These are typically the mid-rise, high-rise, elevator-served buildings downtown with interior hallways that charge premium rents, typically provide nice package of amenities like a wonderful gym that, oh, it's closed. So you've got people who are living in higher densities. And so you can see how tenants would be moving out of those properties. The premier suburban category just above that, that's also suffered a drop in occupancy. Once again, Class A apartments, premium rents at a time when people are going to feel compelled to cut back some. And then you've also, in this premier suburban category, that includes UTC. Those premier suburban apartments catering to UCSD students who in most cases aren't there right now. Now the urban category, think about neighborhoods like the Mid-City, neighborhoods surrounding downtown. So people who like living close into the central area, as they move out of those downtown high rises, they're pushing out into neighborhoods like Hillcrest, North Park. They can get into apartments that have exterior entries, no more elevators, no more interior hallways, also lower rents than what are typically charged downtown. And so we're actually showing an increase in absorption just by a small amount in those neighborhoods, and then the suburban neighborhoods where we're spread out more spaciously, showing an uptick, probably picking up people moving out of the premier suburban because of seeking lower rents and moving out of the CBD. Charlene, if we go to the next slide there. Okay, this one, take this with a grain of salt. The sample size, this data is from CoStar, and I know what they're sampling. They're sampling larger apartment communities, which also tends to be biased towards newer apartment communities. I don't think we're seeing much rent growth anywhere. But once again, the premier suburban is showing the biggest drop in rents, around 5%. That UTC area, heavily explains that. The CBD also lower rents. They're actually showing in these stats an uptick in rents in the urban and the suburban. What I'm hearing anecdotally from owners with large portfolios, 4,000 units, 8,000 units, lot of reference points. We have seen a decline in rents, I believe, in most of the communities, between lower rents and incentives, probably limited to around 5%, which, considering what we've been going through, is just a surprisingly strong performance. Some of that may very well be tied to the relief that's come out in the government programs. Some of it might also be tied to rents going on credit cards. So assuming this pandemic persists into next year, we'll see how all of this holds up. Finally, Charlene, the final slide there. Now we're looking at the actual the market for apartment sales. And I can tell you, we were starting to feel a little bit of a slowdown prior to the start of the pandemic. What's surprising is there's still a really strong demand for apartments in what I would call B-grade neighborhoods and better. There's not a lot of inventory being offered out on the market, and it continues to be competitive to try to purchase those properties. The financing has become significantly more difficult. Typically loan-to-value ratios in the 40 to 60% LTV. So that translates into down payments of 40 to 60%. We have some inventory piling up in what I would call the C-grade neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods that are perhaps more susceptible to vacancy over the next 12 months. The Class A and Class B can adjust their rents and fill their units up. But if there's a shortage of tenants, in the long run, it's going to show up in the C market. As far as who's buying, who's selling, that drop in interest rates has made it even more difficult for investors to generate cash flow. You also have some people that are starting to become concerned about the potential impacts of the high rates of government spending and indebtedness triggering inflation. So you've got some reasons for people to make investments out there. In terms of who's selling in the better neighborhoods, most of the owners are just hunkering down. They've been through cycles before. They know this isn't going to last forever. If they're not over leveraged, most of them will weather the storm. We did have a lot of apartments that have been sold over the past 6-8 years by renovators who have been coming in and acquiring these 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old apartment complexes, finally redoing the kitchens and the baths, upgrading the plumbing and the electrical. We've spoken about that at prior State Planning Council sessions. Some of those operators are working with short-term debt. And there's the potential there for some of those flippers to get squeezed. And so to the extent that they're selling, they have a property in a good B-grade neighborhood, they might have to cut their price some, but there's going to be demand. It'll be interesting to see what's going to happen to the flippers who are in the C-grade neighborhoods, and at what price point they may end up selling, or at what price point the groups that lent them the short-term funds are going to end up selling these properties. Over to you, Doug.
Okay, let's touch briefly upon a few other asset classes, and then I want to really talk more about why this cycle is different. And much of this sounds quite upbeat in many fronts, but but the world is not upbeat right now. I mean, until we have a vaccine, everyone understands that there's not really going to be a resolution longer term. this cycle was long in the tooth, even in advance of COVID. So there's a lot of unknowns, which we're going to talk about in detail. But there's some other asset classes that we touched on, and Tim, you touched upon office. You know, it's interesting. I talk to a lot of people, as we all do, and, you know, a lot of office users are clearly rethinking their future use of office. You know, this working from home environment, especially in certain situations, certain company environments, has really been quite successful in making people understand that they may not need to be paying $30, $40, $50 a square foot or more in other markets for rent. And so, you know, I think that the level of that at this point is somewhat undefined, but it's realistic. And there are a lot of people waiting on the sidelines right now that are not going to be rushing to judgment to renegotiate their leases. To the contrary, they're sitting on the sidelines waiting to see where those rent levels go. And I know in downtown San Diego, those rent levels have already gone down rather, which is typical of other markets. So I just would like everybody to chime in a little bit on office. And Tim, maybe you could start with that, interesting in your observation as well.
Well, thanks, Doug. I think it's an interesting topic because, you know, hotels, they price every day. And office, you know, average lease terms are, you know, probably over 5 years. So hotels, I mean, office has done quite well, or surprisingly well, from a collection standpoint, mortgage standpoint. But I think the big debate is this, is you take a company like ours, we've got 100 and some odd employees over at the Aventine, and we're in pretty tight, you know, there was a huge movement, as a lot of people know, to hoteling and higher density, translated to people, how many people per 1,000 square feet. So if you look historically, you know, it used to be 4 people per 1,000 square feet, then it went to 5. The long and short of it is this, here's the big debate. Does JLL, my company, when it renews, does it tell 20% of its workforce to just work from home and take 20% less space? Or does it tell 20% of its workforce to work at home and take the same amount of space, but provide more space between employees? So there's these countervailing forces. You know, it's weird. You walk around office buildings downtown or even in the suburban markets, they're pretty empty. But they're collecting, most of them are collecting rent. My sense is that there will be the kind of countervailing force of, you know what, let's go back to private offices for a lot of people again. Let's spread out these cubes, but let's also send some of the people that can effectively work from home, send them home. So it's the jury's out. I don't think it's all moving in one direction. Right now, the hype is suburbs are back and distance is back and working from home is back. But I can tell you just anecdotally, we're pressing people when they can come in to come in. Personal collaboration and seeing people face to face is somewhat irreplaceable. So my sense is that the hit on office will get a shock absorber from the need to see each other face to face, and perhaps more space per employee in offices.
Right. Any other thoughts on that, Mike or Robert?
I'll just jump in and agree with Tim that I was unaware of the extent to which, you know, the collaboration element is a real key and a motivator until we got into this. And, you know, having spent four plus months at home, I found myself one of the ones that said, you know, I need to be back in the office. And along those lines, you know, I'm really pleased that we can visit with everyone from the North County Estate Planning Council via Zoom, but it's not the same thing. So.
Right. Okay, I agree with that. So let's move along here so that we have enough time to talk about, you know, issues that are near and dear to the hearts of these families that own real estate and how they may be impacted. And, you know, a question I'm frequently asked is really, important is how is this cycle different? You know, the reality of it is, you know, we all remember the RTC driven by entirely different factors. The dot-com, once again, totally different factors with just the bubble that existed. And then the great financial recession of a handful of years ago that was really housing driven. This one, we had a cycle that was very long in the tooth. We all knew that. It was 10 years, approaching 11 years. Historically, that's a long time. And then everything just stopped. And so, you know, I think that the resolution of this will be interesting. And also, all of these cycles have also bred a lot of capital. There are a lot of buyers that are out there always looking for distress. And later we'll talk about that in a little more detail, but just touch briefly on how this is a little different and what we're doing to deal with that. Robert, since you're on the screen, you want to start?
Sure. You know, typically heading into recessions, there are some telltale clues for those who are out, you know, looking. And so there's some advanced warning. In this case, you know, with the shutdown, there was really very little warning. It came so suddenly. You know, a lot of people who tend to be sensitive to market cycles were already positioned for a recession, Doug, just because of the length of the market cycle, as you referred to. But, you know, it definitely raises the issue of addressing reserves. And those who have been through this pandemic are probably going to remember this lesson for the rest of their lives in terms of what they're holding in reserves, you know, where are you taking on your debt, how much leverage, and your ability to withstand that in the event of a sudden disruption. So it's the suddenness, to me, is the major difference.
Right.
Yeah, I would say, Doug, when have we ever seen a time when someone tells you you need to just completely shut your business down and nobody leaves their house for 45 days other than to go to a grocery store? I mean, this isn't a normal recession for retail and the types of businesses that I deal with. There's no similarities whatsoever. And we were on a roll before this happened. I mean, most of the people that I work with, sales were as strong as they've ever been. The economy, from a retail standpoint, restaurant standpoint, all of those categories were extremely strong and on track to have, you know, maybe one of the biggest years they've ever seen. And it just stopped on a dime. So it's a normal recession. You might see spending drop a little bit in some categories, but this is a complete shut down. So nothing like we've ever experienced.
Right. Tim, any brief comments?
You know, to Mike's point, I mean, it's unprecedented. So it's hard to take past recessions and apply a lot of the lessons. But my biggest, I don't know if it's a concern, I think understanding behavioral changes that are going to be permanent, like we talked about working from home. I tend to be somewhat optimistic that the market will drive us back to where we were. For instance, let's just say I decide in 4 or 5 months, things are starting to feel pretty good. I can go get a meeting with a lender that I do business with in New York, and he's willing to meet face to face. My competitor still isn't allowed to fly. Well, what happens is naturally, from an evolutionary competitive standpoint, people start saying, hey guys, we gotta get on the road. Or, hey guys, we gotta send some people to a conference, albeit a small conference. But I think the natural gravitational pull of business and competition will restore most of the behavior we had before. I could be overly optimistic, but I just can't imagine people forever working from their homes, people skipping, not going to restaurants. There's going to be a segment of the community that lives like that, but my sense is that it might not happen overnight, but I think there'll be a natural competitive and evolutionary push back to the sort of activities we pursued pre-COVID.
Doug, if I could jump in with one more point. One thing that is definitely different this time around in the multifamily sector particularly is the speed at which the government intervened in the market and prohibited evictions. And even if they hadn't done that, the courts had closed down. And so most apartment owners were not going to be quick to move to evict people who could not pay the rent because they've been sick with COVID or they were laid off. But just seeing the increasing government intervention, multifamily here in California, state had passed AB 1482, which created some statewide rent control. Fortunately, it was not too severe of a form of rent control. But then to roll into the pandemic and see measures such as AB 3088, which the governor signed a week ago, which not only forestalls evictions into next year, but the collection of back rent. In many cases, tenants could have up to 5 years to pay that back at no interest. And so, it creates a recognition in the multifamily space that there's encroaching regulation that's affecting our property rights. So it's something to give pause to.
No question about it. I think there are a lot of changes, and once again, those that are agile, that can adapt, will survive. But in the meantime, it's naive to think there won't be challenges. I mean, we have dealt with a significant forbearance that not only liquidity infused into the market, but in the world of a lot of these securitized lenders, especially with hotel assets, are saying use your reserves, do whatever you can. But at some point, as Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, you still has their swimming suit on. And the fact of the matter is, I built a career built on good times and bad times, and I'm not as someone that is negative at all. I'm an Irish optimist. That having been said, we're kind of like a canary in the coal mine. And when issues do percolate to the surface, we, due to our 30-year history of having been a receiver on 1,000 matters all over the country, we get phone calls. And I can tell you that there are, even though a lot of this is very positive, the reality of it, you can't have this kind of systemic shock impact our society in general and subsequently real estate without some impacts. And there are going to be impacts. We're seeing it now, not just on defaulted loans, although a lot of people, there will be defaulted loans more in the future when forbearance goes away. But lenders I know are going to be post-forbearance looking at other remedies. There could be restructure remedies or other alternatives. There's been changes in some of the bankruptcy laws of late that could impact, some of these alternatives that are out there. So it's something I think we all have to keep our eye on. On receiverships for a moment, because I want to touch on that, because that's something people are often confused about, or what that means. It's kind of an evil, draconian thing. The reality is, I started this business after developing Symphony Towers and watched all my friends go broke in the 80s with the energy collapse. And I noticed that most real estate developers were clueless about cycles. They believed that cycles would never happen, but in fact, they do happen. They're powerful. And when illiquidity impacts real estate, it's a powerful factor. So I started this business as a survival technique and have grown it into an institutional platform, because a receiver steps in not to rape and pillage a property, but to try to bring stability, to lend balance, to have a preservation of the value of the assets. Oftentimes a receiver is in place when there is a defaulted loan. That's one particular process is probably very typical, but there are other processes or other opportunities to put a receiver in that we're seeing now that I think are very much on point with this agenda today, because partnerships happen. When times like this occur, after a lengthy run-up, and frothy values being realized. When things begin to get challenged, oftentimes partnerships are stressed and they start pointing fingers, and that results in litigation substantially up. You know, and we are seeing that as well with our inquiries. There's one case in point where there's a very prominent family in California, obviously will remain unnamed. And this family is dealing with 3 generations of significant wealth in real estate. And the family has been unable to really come up with a resolution of how to deal with this in a way that's satisfactory to each of the family members. And so after, you know, literally a number of years of litigation and going through mediation and eventually an arbitration hearing, they are named, I am the named receiver in a state court procedure to take over all of the partnership assets to try to preserve and maintain the value of those assets, and then ultimately to monetize and liquidate those assets in accordance with a court order. And so, you know, so my point being is that that remedy as a receiver or a trustee or a liquidating agent, there are a lot of terms for that, are going to be more prevalent. During the last recession, they were remarkably prevalent. I personally don't think they'll be as prevalent in this particular cycle, but I do think it's naive to think that there aren't going to be certain challenges that we're going to have to be going through, because, you know, we may be feeling good, but Main Street's not feeling quite as good, and that there's got to be some stability on that front. So I'd really like now to, we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A, by the way. I think that's important for us to do, but I'd like now to talk a bit about our advice to people that own real estate, our advice to these families that are dealing with these challenges, and how do they deal with their tenant that comes in that's been there for 5 years and say, you know, I need help, and how do we restructure that, and how do you pass that on to your lender to say, I need help, lender, with the Age of Forbearance. So Mike, you're dealing with a lot of tenants that aren't able to pay the rent they'd like to pay or could pay in the past, and the owners that have the challenge of that. And so what are some of your advice in that area?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's really got to be a case-by-case analysis and decision. Where I saw people, I guess, going off the wrong tracks initially was, you know, if they had multiple shopping centers and they wanted a one-size-fits-all solution, and that might be, let's just abate everybody's rent for 90 days and tack it on to, you know, the next 2 years or whatever that solution was. The one-size-fits-all doesn't really make sense. I think what you have to do if you own a retail asset is you have to look at each lease, determine if that lease is undervalued, overvalued, what it would cost you to replace them, who is the replacement if you had to replace them, is the tenant viable? There's a whole bunch of factors that we're helping our clients review and evaluate before we determine the step with each and every tenant. And I think it's really important that you do it on an individual basis.
Isn't this really being driven by the cost to re-tenant a space as opposed to maintaining, keeping somebody on life support is just in many ways prohibitive?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, there's some tenants who want to renegotiate their leases now and they're not even open. So you've got an event space operator who wants you to forgive his rent for the last 5 months, and they don't have any events booked for the next year. So why negotiate? You're better off getting control of your real estate and figuring out what to do with it today versus wishing on a hope certificate that use is going to be viable a year from now. Same with movie theaters. I just had a client yesterday who's got a large movie theater, and I mean, some of the movie theaters are closing down again. Yesterday morning, one of the CEOs, the CEO for Regal, said basically, we're a grocery store and we have no groceries on the shelf. The movies are not coming out, so there's nothing to sell. So if you've got the movie theaters want you to forgive their rent, well, when are they going to open? When are they going to start showing movies? When are people going to come back? If you've got a space that you can use for something else that could be more valuable, then you might want to take a hard line stance with somebody who's not paying you any rent today. And maybe you negotiate the right to terminate as part of some forgiveness so that you've now control your destiny going into the future.
Do you think this is a climate that poses an opportunity for investors to buy retail? I'm talking about not malls, but smaller retail. Or is this way too early to really to determine where those values are going to fall out?
I think it's sketchy right now because I think that there's still a lot of fog in the air, and determining who's going to be viable and who isn't is tough to do. So you really need to know what you're buying and what that income stream is going to look like going into the future, and plan accordingly. I think it's a little bit early.
So Robert, in light of the fact that the rents have been surprisingly strong and collections have been strong, which I think we've all been amazed and pleasantly surprised by in the multifamily, I guess, the takeaway lessons you would offer to those that are owners of multifamily, just keep everybody happy and keep paying the rent?
Yeah, for the owners right now, if you have well-positioned assets that are not in any risk, ride this out. Typically there's no need to go and liquidate viable investment. And in terms of any opportunity opening up, I think we're going to be looking into the first quarter and second quarter of next year to see if the tenants are able to sustain the level of rent payments that we've been receiving. It has been surprisingly good, but I'm still wondering if it's sustainable or not. And Doug, you asked about lessons once again, and it goes to the reserves. Having those reserves in terms of liquidity, because equity in property right now is more difficult to tap. There is financing available, but it has become more problematic at lower LTVs.
So in a minute, we're going to turn it over to Q&A. But in advance of that, Tim, I'd like to auger into a little more detail, like on hotels. My firm understands hotels. We've done a gazillion hotel workouts. I've developed hotels, and you're right. There are certain sectors that are doing okay, but generally, full service hotels or non-starters, resort hotels are not doing well and have operating costs that are very, very prohibitive. So, I think we have got a long road to haul to really see the resolution. Group business is not coming back till people are getting on airplanes and traveling, and companies are allowing that to happen. I'm hearing about hotels being converted to multifamily, especially extended stay hotels and old Marriotts and the like. And so just curious, Tim, about a little more detail on the hotel space and the segments. And are you hearing about some of these hotels being bought by others that want to convert to multifamily?
Yeah, no, we're seeing it. Absolutely, we're seeing some hotel properties being converted to affordable, not in huge waves, but it's certainly happening. I think it goes without saying, I think if you look across the product type spectrum, hotels are going to be the first to come onto the market as distressed assets to buy, either notes or foreclosed upon hotels. But even with that said, we got a lot of calls from, in April and May from clients. We would get a call. I think they want to talk about their own property, but in reality, they're saying, "Hey, are there any bargains out there?" And it's the forbearance has really kind of delayed and given some hope to a lot of properties. But we're hitting distress on the hotel side. CMBS probably a good proxy given the amount of hotels they have. They've taken, billions into special servicing. We're seeing a lot of money amassing at the gates to try to either buy hotel notes or to come in and help lenders restructure them, where they may take a subordinate piece, keep the loan current with the ultimate goal of acquiring the property. But I think that we'll see a pretty good wave of hotel activity because of COVID, probably beginning a quarter or two before you see other product types. But it's already starting to happen as we approach the fourth quarter. First and second quarter should be pretty interesting with respect to what lenders are doing with respect to note sales and foreclosures.
Good, thank you for that insight. And I think that's the general consensus is between that and the election and just general volatility, what happens early next year will be interesting for all of us. So we have to stay adaptable. So anyway, thank you for that and all the comments. I think it'd be timely because we've got about 10, 12 minutes left if we turn this over to some Q&A. So Charlene, we'll let you have the stage.
Good morning. We have a question from Hannah. She says, we have a client looking for a 1031 exchange of a new property in San Diego County. Given the uncertainty, what factors should they consider?
You broke up a little bit, but Robert, do you want to answer that?
Sure, I'll jump in, and maybe Mike and Tim might want to add to it. In terms of looking for a safe type of property to consider, once again, multifamily and B-grade neighborhoods are better, and then also industrial. Industrial has seen really strong demand. A lot of the shift out of retail has led to increase in demand for industrial. And I'd be biased right now towards multi-tenant and also taking a hard look at the tenants in the property as to whether they're recession resistant or pandemic resistant, or are they in a category, for example, selling restaurant supplies that's probably going to be hurting for the next few years. Mike, any additional thoughts, or Tim?
I would say, anything essential retail, quick service. We sold an In-N-Out burger, a Chick-fil-A. People like that are having a field day in this environment. Any folks that are doing a lot of takeout and delivery are very strong, along with all the grocery anchored neighborhood centers. And what's interesting is when you think about the neighborhood centers that are in the suburbs, everybody's staying at home and they're going down to their local neighborhood center. So we're seeing those centers actually perform very well, as opposed to some of the downtown, the gas lamps and districts that are suffering quite a bit more.
I'd say I agree with Robert. Product type wise, multifamily and industrial. I like multi-tenant industrial, but single tenant makes sense if the tenant has proven to be COVID or recession resistant. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing Amazons pop up all over the country. A lot of people will build them and then sell them. Yields aren't great, but they tend to be a pretty fair risk-adjusted return. And then essential retail, again, I think there's probably some really good value there just because of the broad brush the product type's been painted with, but there's some retail that makes a lot of sense too.
There's one more question from Terry. If there's not another bill to provide income to laid off people, what will that do to multifamily property rent payment?
Well, I'm going to let Robert answer that and others, but that, I don't own multifamily. I understand it, I think generally, but, I think that's a simple and powerful question because, we had so much liquidity and so many people, including one of my kids was working in a hotel, the Pendry, and then immediately out of work and survived for a handful of months on these payments. And now he's able to go back to work, but there are a lot of people that haven't, and now those payments have stopped. And so there's been kind of a gnashing of teeth whether there is going to be subsequent infusion of liquidity from the federal government. But assuming there is not, I'm interested, Robert, and everyone else, to get your view on that, because, again, the little people add up.
And Charlene, the sound, I had a little garble in the sound, so I didn't hear the final portion of the, okay, I'm actually seeing it pop up on my screen now, the second half of the question. How quickly will the market experience the impact right after the election or further down the line? That's a
different question.
I've been looking at a different question.
Yeah, the first question, Robert, that I had mentioned before was, if there's not another bill to provide income to laid off people, what will that do to the multifamily property rent payments?
Obviously, you're going to see more tenants going into default. So far, tenants in San Diego County have been pretty good about not gaming the system and not taking advantage of, unfair advantage of the regulations that are prohibiting evictions right now. Most of the property management companies and large owners got out in front of the curve and educated the tenants that they're still responsible for the rent, even if they can't make the payments. And so while Tim had mentioned we didn't see much movement in apartments among tenants in the first couple of months of the pandemic, at the beginning of the summer, we did see kind of a surge in tenants moving around and basically adjusting. Some of them moving down to less expensive rents, some of them moving up into larger spaces because they're working from home. And so the tenants who can't pay, you're obviously stuck carrying them if you can't counsel them out of the units. And we have seen cases where the tenants can't pay, they realize they could stay in place and accrue debt, which they don't want to do, and so they do end up moving out and moving into with other residents. Worst case scenario for an apartment owner is not a vacancy. It's a tenant in place who either can't or won't pay, and because of that, you can't re-rent the unit. So I would anticipate, as this pandemic stretches into next year, we are going to see greater collection problems. It's going to begin to pinch owners. I'm already hearing from owners who are pinched who have been living off their cash flows as a retirement income, and so they're having to cut back a little bit. It does tend to take a period of time, though, for the distress to work its way through the process and into the market, for the owners to feel enough distress till they're actually out attempting to market the properties and they're hitting the market in sufficient numbers that it puts downward pressure on pricing. And so unless this down cycle, I'm talking about the economic impact of the pandemic, unless it cycles down next year into, from a bad recession into a depression, I don't think we're going to see a big impact on apartment valuations in mid-grade neighborhoods or better. I think we're already seeing some erosion of values in the C-grade neighborhoods. If this does spiral down into more of a depression than a recession, then that distress will spread through the market, but it's going to take a while. Think in terms of a period of a couple of years, not a couple of months.
Any other questions?
There was one more question. What advice can you give to an owner of a retail space whose tenant has filed for bankruptcy?
Mike?
Oh, that was for retail?
Yes, retail space whose tenant has filed for bankruptcy.
Well, unfortunately, you're along for the ride through the bankruptcy. I mean, hope there is a period of time in which the tenant will have to either accept or reject the lease. So if they filed, then you basically have to wait until that election takes place and determine if they're going to stay or vacate.
Thank you.
We have done some renegotiations with tenants, you know, who are in bankruptcy as well, to try and reposition leases. I just did one on a 24-hour fitness lease, and they obviously went bankrupt. In the case that I was working on, the rent was way over market, so we elected to renegotiate, drop the rent down a little bit, forgive a few months rent, and then extend their lease out with a new 10-year term. It was down to 4 years. So we got some value for the landlord by negotiating some benefits to the tenant. So if there's, you know, some way that you can get value for yourself and the tenant is in a position where they want to negotiate, you know, even during the bankruptcy, then that's a possibility as well.
Doug, if there's time, you have one more question. Is there time for that?
Yes, we have one more question, please.
It's sort of a follow-up question we were discussing earlier about government assistance and how that's had an impact. And also the question has now become, add on to that, the election. How quickly will the market experience the impact of whichever party comes in right after the election results or further down the line? Can you address what might be that impact and how soon it might change?
Well, I absolutely have the answer. I know exactly what. I actually have no idea. I think it's a guess. I think, candidly, from my perspective, even though I build a business predicated on cycles, it's that crystal ball is something that's always evaded me, and so there's just too many unknowns out there now to have any great clarity or certainty. Is to say what is a clear path post the election from my perspective, but I'd love to hear what others say. Tim, what are your thoughts?
I don't have the crystal ball either. You know, I think that, again, I think that a lot of it's going to depend on really, unfortunately, kind of a saleable vaccine where there's a sense that people could go out again and really feel, you know, more or less immune to the effects of the virus before a lot of the economy will return to pre-COVID levels.
Any other thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll jump in. If you think of the stock market as being a Ferrari, stock market can turn on a dime, and it does. Think of the real estate market as a mile-long freight train or one of those big quarter-mile-long super tankers. In terms of the impact of the election on the market, I don't see anything immediate. In the long term, though, if tax rates go up, especially favorable treatment for capital gains is adversely impacted, or Section 1031 tax deferred exchanges are eliminated, and Biden has mentioned both of those as possibilities, then you're looking at substantially lower transaction volumes. Just people become more entrenched in their ownership.
Or Prop 15. That's an immediate one.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I think we're out of time. I have, in closing, just a few comments and lessons, I think, for those of you in the room with real estate assets, dealing with families. And, you know, obviously, you know, we're in for some unforeseen challenges. So I think there are a few takeaways that I've learned in my career from being on both sides of the coin, both as a developer owner, someone that's taken over projects and challenges. And that is to make certain that you are, if you have a problem, make sure you're always completely transparent, either with, if you're a tenant dealing with an owner, If you're an owner dealing with a lender, transparency is the best remedy. And to be proactive, to be able to anticipate events that are coming. Do you have a loan that's coming up? Do you have leases that are expiring? All of these things, if you can be dynamic and proactive and to anticipate what is coming down path, I think that's going to be very, very helpful. So you've got to plan for the future and don't be reactive. I mean, the worst thing you can do is exercise denial, to go into a hole and to pretend that it's all going to get better. It gets better only through paying attention, being forthright, and working with professionals to come up with a grown-up resolution. And so I'd like today to really thank our panelists. I think they're wonderful and great insights. So thank you to Mike and Tim and Robert. I found this, we really appreciate having the format to share some of these thoughts and insight. I know this is different than some of the programs we had before at the council, but hopefully this allows everyone to have some thought moving forward into next year. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Doug. That was great. And thanks to the panel, Robert, Tim, Michael. You did a wonderful job. Really appreciate everything. Just to give you a quick update on Bill, he is recovering well and is almost back to 100%. So we expect to see him back moderating these forms soon. Thank you all for attending. And remember, the November 3rd event, where we're going to be talking about planning using charitable remainderment trust for IRAs. Again, thank you very much, and everyone have a wonderful day and a great week. Thank you.